Amsterdam, 1648. A city of 200,000 people rises from water and timber and trade, its skyline broken not by smokestacks but by sails, hundreds of them, turning slowly against a gray northern sky. Distributed across every canal district, every polder edge, every river bend for as far as any map of that era reaches. No coal furnaces, no steam pressure chambers, no centralized power plant of any kind. And yet the city hums with a productivity that later historians would struggle to explain without invoking the Industrial Revolution, which would not arrive for another century and a half. Lumber arrives, cut and dimensioned. Paper arrives, pressed and dried. Cloth arrives, dyed and folded. Whale oil arrives, refined and ready for trade. The infrastructure producing all of it stands in plain sight, turning in the wind. And for 3.5 centuries, the world has looked at those turning sails and thought, grain mills, simple, agricultural, quaint, picturesque relics of a slower age, preserved now behind velvet ropes and UNESCO plaques, photographed by tourists who have no reason to ask what they are actually looking at. But open the municipal tax registers of the Dutch Republic from 1648 and something stops you cold. The records do not list grain output alone. They list 14 distinct categories of mechanical production per tower: structure drainage, sawmill operation, paper pressing, dye processing, oil extraction, textile fulling, mustard grinding, pigment milling, hemp processing, and more networked across districts like links in a deliberately engineered chain. Not isolated devices, not simple grain grinders. And then, sometime around 1812, those 14 categories vanish from the official record entirely. Every tower in every document across 6 nations becomes simply a molen, a mill. One word, one function, one sanitized, agricultural, non-threatening identity stamped across an infrastructure that had powered a civilization. Something about this does not add up. And the deeper you look into the archive, into the yellowed pages of guild contracts, into the water-stained margins of colonial ordinances, into the bureaucratic ledgers of a Napoleonic surveying commission that reshaped the legal vocabulary of an entire continent, the more the official explanation begins to fall apart. To understand why the true function of these structures disappeared, you have to go back to a moment before they were called windmills at all. The machine existed before the word that buried it. And that is where the story starts. In the 12th century, in the high desert plains where modern Afghanistan meets modern Iran, in a region known as Sistan, a horizontal wind catches a set of reed-bundled sails attached to a vertical shaft, and the shaft turns a grinding stone with a mechanical consistency that no human or animal-powered system of the era could match for sustained output. This is not metaphor. This is engineering documented, measurable, and old enough to challenge every timeline that places the origin of complex mechanical infrastructure inside the workshops of early modern Europe. The Sistan wind catcher towers are recorded by the 10th century Islamic geographer al-Masudi, who describes irrigation networks, powered by them networks, serving tens of thousands of agricultural workers across a landscape that would otherwise be too arid to sustain the populations that live there. These are not decorative structures. They are functional infrastructure embedded in the daily survival of entire communities, and they predate the earliest confirmed European equivalent by more than 500 years. In 1206, the polymath al-Jazari publishes his Book of Ingenious Devices, a manuscript cataloging mechanical systems of extraordinary precision gear ratios, crank mechanisms, flow regulators, pressure conversion chambers, and the tower machines it describes share load-bearing geometries and drive shaft configurations with structures that would appear independently, according to the official record, in Flemish lowland engineering 2 full centuries later. The same crown wheel arrangement, the same lay shaft logic, the same relationship between sail surface area and mechanical torque output, the same machine. 2 civilizations. No acknowledged connection in any engineering history curriculum that has ever been formally adopted anywhere in the world. That unanswered question sits at the center of this story, like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples from it reach forward through 800 years of institutional silence all the way to the present. The pattern begins in Sistan, and it does not stop there. By the 14th century, The tower technology that al-Masudi documented is present across Persia, through Central Asia, into Iberia, and into the British Isles, each instance treated by official engineering history as a separate, locally derived invention with no genealogy connecting it to anything that came before. Roger Bacon, the English philosopher and early mechanical theorist who died around 1292, wrote about wind-driven mechanical devices in terms that suggest familiarity with a body of technical knowledge broader than any single regional tradition could have produced in isolation. The Crusader-era translation movements that carried Arabic scientific manuscripts into Latin European libraries remain, in the specific area of mechanical tower design, incompletely catalogued. What was in the Library of Toledo before its partial destruction in 1499? What mechanical knowledge passed through those translation networks and into the hands of Flemish engineers is a question that historians have not answered, because it is a question that, as far as the available record shows, historians have not systematically asked. The knowledge moved. The institutions just refused to follow it. By 1400, the tower systems of Northern Europe are not scattered curiosities studied by philosophers. They are infrastructure embedded in land, in law, in the daily rhythms of communities that have organized their economic lives around what the towers produce and how they produce it. In the Zaan district north of Amsterdam, the density of functioning towers rivals anything the early industrial revolution will later produce in Manchester, and the organizational logic governing how they work together is more sophisticated than most histories of technology have been willing to acknowledge. By 1630, 600 industrial towers operate across the Zaan region alone, and the engineer, Jan Adriaan Zoon Leegwater, born in 1575, has spent his career designing drainage networks in which multiple tower systems work in coordinated sequence to move water across elevation gradients that no single machine could manage independently. Leegwater's notebooks, the portions that survive, describe towers as calibrated instruments, not passive devices. Their sail configurations are adjusted seasonally. Their shaft angles are calculated against prevailing wind direction charts that the Molinar guilds maintained across generations. Their output is synchronized with adjacent towers and relay systems that sound less like pre-industrial craft and more like distributed mechanical engineering of a kind that the 19th century would later claim to have invented from scratch. The towers produce paper. They produce dimensioned lumber. They produce pressed cloth and refined oil, and pigments for paint and ground mustard for trade. They produce the material conditions of a civilization. And critically, they belong to no single owner. The organizational model encoded in the Zaan notarial records of 1610 through 1650 is one of community bonding. Towers are held in common by the guilds and districts that built and maintained them, with output shared across multiple workshops and households downstream. There is no lord of the wind. There is no crown patent on the movement of air across a flat landscape. No single merchant house controls the fuel source, because the fuel source is the weather itself, ungovernable, untaxable, and available to anyone with the mechanical knowledge to capture it. This is the first thing you need to understand, because it is the fact that everything else in this story turns on. And here is the irony that the official record has never cleanly stated, never printed in a textbook, never incorporated into the energy history curricula of any nation that subsequently built its wealth on centralized fossil fuel extraction. The towers were not replaced because something better came along. They were replaced because the thing that came along could be owned. Steam required coal. Coal required mines. Mines required capital. Capital required consolidation into the hands of the few who could afford to purchase land, extract resources, and build the infrastructure of centralized industrial production. The tower network required none of these things. It required wind, which moved freely across the landscape, and community knowledge, which passed between hands and generations without a deed of sale or a corporate charter. The machine itself was not the threat. The independence it granted to the communities that operated it was That distinction between the technology and its organizational implications is the unveiling irony at the heart of this story, and once you see it, the events that follow become not a series of accidents, but a sequence. Cornelis Meyer, the Dutch hydraulic engineer working in the latter half of the 17th century, understood the tower network as a civic system, something built and maintained by communities for communities. Its knowledge held inside guilds, rather than published in treatises that crown or company could claim as intellectual property. The Molinar guilds of Northern Europe encoded their mechanical knowledge not in books, but in practice. Gear ratios memorized across apprenticeships. Tower orientation formulas taught through the hands of a master guiding a student's grip on a calibration instrument. Seasonal adjustment systems held inside families for whom the knowledge was livelihood, not theory. Guild contracts from this period contained confidentiality clauses specific to mechanical specifications, not trade secrets in the modern corporate sense, but communal protections against the extraction of knowledge that the guild understood as belonging to its members collectively. No published technical manual for tower construction exists before 1750. Not one. Not because the knowledge didn't exist. Leaguewater's notebooks and the partial guild archives prove that it did, in extraordinary detail, but because the knowledge was deliberately structured to live in bodies and in hands and in oral transmission chains, not on paper that could be seized, standardized, and put to work for someone else's accumulation. The Dutch mathematician and engineer Simon Steven, born in 1548, spent the final decades of his career producing hydraulic manuscripts of considerable technical depth. Partial guild charter archives reference his formulas. The location of his complete manuscript collection is, according to researchers who have searched for it, uncertain, and that uncertainty, the gap between what Steven demonstrably knew and what the archive has chosen to preserve, is itself a kind of document. When the guilds began dissolving under the economic pressures of the early 18th century, the mechanical knowledge they carried did not transfer smoothly into the new industrial order. It dissipated. It aged out with the practitioners who held it. It became, in the vocabulary of the institutions that followed, folklore. And in the silence left by that dissolution, something else moved in with a precision that is difficult, in retrospect, to read as coincidental. By 1700, the towers still turn and still produce, but the political conditions around them are shifting in ways that the tax registers alone cannot fully capture. In 1759, the English engineer John Smeaton publishes an experimental study of tower mechanical systems, a careful, methodical comparison of gear configurations, and finds that the older designs, the ones the Molinar guilds had refined across generations of accumulated practice, outperform the newer simplified designs being promoted under the banner of modernization by a margin. His instruments record as approximately 23%. His findings enter the Royal Society archives. They are not cited in a single parliamentary debate on energy infrastructure. Not once, not in the year of publication, not in the decade following, not ever, as far as the surviving record shows. Historians have not explained why. The experiment proved the old machine worked better. The experiment was ignored. What was happening in the political background of Smeaton's buried findings becomes clearer when you trace the lobbying activity of Matthew Boulton, the Birmingham manufacturer and commercial architect of the steam engine's industrial expansion, through his correspondence with parliamentary contacts in the years around 1781. Boulton was not arguing in those letters that steam could outperform wind as a mechanical energy source. He was arguing against the continuation of maintenance subsidies for the distributed tower infrastructure that still functioned across the English countryside and the Dutch lowlands. The lobbying was not framed as technological competition. It was framed as fiscal responsibility. Why should the state fund the upkeep of an old agricultural system when private enterprise stood ready to provide modern alternatives? The subsidy failed. The towers aged without renewal funding. The communities that had maintained them found the economic ground shifting beneath the organizational models that had sustained the network for 2 centuries. And this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, because the result of withdrawing maintenance funding from a distributed community infrastructure is not technological replacement, It is dependency creation. Remove the funding, and the towers age out. Remove the towers, and the communities depend on coal. Depend on coal, and you depend on the men who own the mines and the machines that burn it. The Industrial Revolution was not the victory of a better machine. It was the victory of a machine someone could own. That calculation, precise, economic, deliberate, and traceable through surviving correspondence, is what the standard narrative of technological progress has consistently declined to name. And then, between 1795 and 1815, something happens to the language itself that makes the erasure permanent in a way that no physical demolition could have achieved. Napoleon's administrative apparatus sweeps across Europe, and behind the armies come the surveyors and the clerks and the standardization commissions, reordering every category of economic life into uniform registers that a centralized imperial state could read, tax, and control. Jean-Baptiste de Belange and the engineers of the French Imperial Cadastral Survey System reclassify tower infrastructure across the occupied territories with a bureaucratic thoroughness that is, in its own way, a form of violence. Before 1795, Dutch civic records use the term energy works, to describe the tower networks that power the Zaan district and its surrounding regions. After 1812, those same structures appear in every official document, in every nation under French administrative influence, under a single standardized word: molens, mills. Agricultural infrastructure, not energy systems, not distributed industrial networks, not mechanical engineering. Mills. The word change appears simultaneously across 6 nations. Whether the linguistic standardization was the result of a coordinated policy directive or an emergent bureaucratic consequence of applying uniform Napoleonic categories to pre-existing complexity, that specific question has not been formally answered in any published historical study. But the timing is exact. The year the cadastral surveys complete their reclassification is the year the tower network ceases to exist in any official sense as an energy system. They did not need to destroy the towers. They renamed them. And the renaming was enough, because the name determined what the thing was allowed to be in every document, every curriculum, every engineering history, every policy debate that followed. What followed the renaming unfolded on 2 tracks simultaneously across the 19th century, one administrative and European, one colonial and global. In Europe, the post-Napoleonic decade saw the practical infrastructure of the tower networks age without renewal. Community ownership models, disrupted by land reform commissions that redistributed collectively held assets into private hands, and mechanical knowledge, dissipate as the guild practitioners who had carried it aged out of a labor economy that had stopped valuing what they knew. James Watt Jr., operating as advocate and beneficiary of steam's expansion through the first half of the 19th century, worked within a political environment where the choice between distributed wind infrastructure and centralized steam had already effectively been made, not through any public debate about technological merit, but through administrative reclassification and the quiet withdrawal of the collective maintenance structures that had kept the old network alive. In colonial India, the suppression took a more direct and more documented form. British colonial administration in the Punjab during the 1830s moved systematically against community-owned water tower systems that had functioned for generations as the irrigation infrastructure of agricultural communities across the region. The East India Company's administrative orders from 1832 through 1847 framed the dismantling as modernization, a technical upgrade from primitive local devices to advanced industrial equipment. What the pre-1830 Punjab records show, where they have been examined, is more than 3,000 functioning water towers serving populations that had organized their farming calendars, their crop rotations, and their seasonal labor patterns around what those towers reliably produced. By 1870, fewer than 200 of those towers remained operational. They had been replaced by company-owned steam pumps, requiring imported British coal, a dependency chain that generated profit for the company, generated tax revenue for the colonial administration, and generated a form of structural vulnerability in the communities it displaced that had not existed before. The technical knowledge held by the families and communities that had maintained those towers across generations was not recorded, it was not archived, it was not transferred into any formal knowledge system. It was displaced along with the people who carried it, and no colonial report filed during the period accounts for where it went. The mechanism of erasure moved, in the second half of the 19th century, into the museums and universities of Europe and North America, where it became something more durable than any colonial ordinance. It became academic consensus. Between 1880 and 1910, a reclassification took place inside the institutions that shaped how history was taught, organized, and remembered. Pre-industrial tower systems, which had been analyzed in technical journals of the 1870s as examples of sophisticated distributed mechanical engineering, began disappearing from engineering history curricula and reappearing, when they appeared at all, as folk artifacts, charming objects of agricultural heritage, symbols of pre-modern simplicity, appropriate for ethnographic display rather than engineering analysis. Franz Maria Feldhaus, the German historian of technology born in 1874, documented technical achievements of the pre-industrial period with a scholarly rigor that his contemporaries in mainstream institutions largely failed to carry forward or fund. The Smithsonian Institution's object reclassification ledgers from 1880 through 1910 contain entries for pre-industrial mechanical tower components that shifted categorization during this period from engineering specimens to cultural heritage objects, without any published curatorial rationale explaining the decision. The German Polytechnisches Journal, which had carried substantive technical analyses of tower mechanical systems through the 1870s, ceases to reference them entirely by 1910. No editorial policy explaining that disappearance has been published. No coordinating memo between institutions has surfaced. The machine did not disappear from the landscape. It disappeared from the mind, which is a more complete and more durable form of erasure, because a physical structure can be rediscovered, but a category that has been reclassified out of existence leaves no obvious gap where it used to be, and then, surviving in the place where the institutional erasure never fully reached, something extraordinary. In the Sistan region on the Afghanistan-Iran border, more than 30 wind towers still stand at Nashtafan and still function. They operate on the original horizontal axis design. Their mechanical configuration has not been significantly modified in at least 2 centuries. The families who maintain them hold technical knowledge transmitted across generations through direct oral instruction knowledge that corresponds in its principles, its gear logic, and its structural specifications to what Al-Jazari described and illustrated in his 1206 manuscript. The alignment between the living oral tradition and the 800-year-old written record is not approximate. It is precise in ways that suggest an unbroken chain of transmission across a span of time that the official history of mechanical engineering has never acknowledged or mapped. UNESCO's Intangible Heritage Documentation for Nashtafan, completed in 2022, records this continuity and flags its significance. No academic engineering institution has formally compared the oral technical tradition of the Nashtafan maintainers with the Al-Jazari diagrams, or with the guild specifications preserved in partial Dutch archives, or with the mechanical configurations recorded in Leaguewater's notebooks. No grant has been funded for that comparison. The knowledge survived not in universities, not in state archives, not in any institution whose mandate included the preservation of engineering history. It survived in the hands of people whom the institutions that erase the broader history never thought to interview. The living transmission outlasted the institutional erasure, and that the fact of its survival in precisely the place and form that no standardization commission ever reached is the detail the official silence cannot absorb without cracking. In 1934, Lewis Mumford published Technics and Civilization, a work of historical synthesis that explicitly named the shape of what had happened. Mumford identified the pre-industrial tower network as part of what he called the Neotechnic phase, a distributed, ecologically integrated energy system that was not a crude precursor to industrial power, but a laterally suppressed alternative to it, one that had been organizationally viable and mechanically sophisticated before the conditions of centralized capitalism made its community ownership model politically untenable. His framework was not adopted in any national energy curriculum. It was cited by more than 400 researchers across the 20th century. It changed nothing in how energy history is taught to the students who will design the next century's infrastructure. The silence that settled over Mumford's framework has a shape. It fits exactly around the thing that was removed, the distributed, community-held, wind-powered energy network that the industrial age reclassified as folklore and the colonial age dismantled as obstruction. Today, in Denmark and in Germany, community wind cooperatives have become some of the most studied and replicated models in the renewable energy transition structures, in which turbine output is shared across networks of community stakeholders. Maintenance costs are held collectively, and no single corporate owner controls the fuel source, because the fuel source is again the wind, which moves freely and cannot be purchased. The Danish Wind Energy Association's cooperative charter history describes organizational principles, distributed output sharing, communal maintenance bonding, non-transferable community stakes in the energy infrastructure they collectively maintain that are structurally identical to the arrangements recorded in the Zahn notarial documents of 1610 through 1650. The logic re-emerged independently across an interval of 3 centuries because the underlying problem never changed. No energy policy document that can currently be located acknowledges this historical continuity. The cooperatives were not designed to replicate a suppressed 17th century model. They arrived at the same answer because the question, how do communities sustain themselves on energy that no one can own, was never actually resolved. It was only silenced. And the silence, it turns out, has a duration, but not a permanence. Back to Amsterdam, 1648, and the turning sails against a gray northern sky, and the 14 categories of mechanical output that the tax registers recorded and no curriculum ever named, and the single word that collapsed all of it into something picturesque and harmless and easy to photograph without asking what it actually was. The towers were not ruins. They were an answer to a question that the industrial age decided was too dangerous to keep asking: what happens when energy belongs to everyone, when the fuel cannot be enclosed or metered or sold, when the infrastructure is the community itself and the community is the owner? They named them windmills to make you think they were simple. They were never simple. They were the last infrastructure the wind built before someone figured out how to own the fire instead.